Sometimes I sit by the window of my little apartment in South Chicago and watch the traffic pass beneath the streetlights like slow-moving stars. The city feels distant now, loud, young, unbothered. But I still live inside it like an old photograph tucked behind the glass. My children think they know me. They think I am only their mother, soft-spoken, gentle, composed in the way women become after too many years of silence. They don't know the world I survived. They don't know the man whose love built the bones of my life, or the truth that destroyed us both. Tonight I will tell them. Not because I want pity. God knows pity was never mine to ask for, but because truth is a weight you cannot carry alone forever. And maybe by speaking it, I will finally breathe like a woman unburdened. It began 25 years ago, on a winter afternoon colder than any I remember. Chicago wind is sharp. It doesn't just touch skin, it cuts it. And I was leaving a credit union building downtown, paperwork tucked beneath my coat, thinking only of dinner and overdue rent. Life was small back then. Routine. Manageable in the way grief becomes manageable with time. And then I saw him. A thin man near a dumpster in an alley behind Michigan Avenue, bent over as if the sky itself pressed against his spine. I recognized him not by his face. Time had sculpted new lines into him, but by his shoulders, still sloped the same way they were the night we danced after our wedding. He was rummaging through trash like someone hunting treasure, picking aluminum cans with trembling fingers, slipping them into a torn grocery bag. I froze. Cars moved. People passed. But for me the world narrowed to a breath. It was Jonathan Reed. My husband. The man who vanished 22 years ago without a word, leaving me with signed divorce papers, debts I never owed, and a heart that hardened into something that kept me alive. He didn't know I was there. I watched him for long seconds, feeling something break open inside me. Rage, love, disbelief, grief, everything tangled like wires. His hair had lost its chestnut shine. His beard had grown wild. His coat was thin enough to see bone beneath fabric. He had once been a respected structural engineer in Detroit, a man who built bridges, towers, lives. Yet here he was, invisible to everyone but me. I took one step forward, then another. My boots clicked against the icy pavement, a sound too loud in a world suddenly fragile. Jonathan lifted his head, sensing movement the way a wounded animal senses threat. Our eyes locked and something inside him collapsed. He recognized me. I saw it, that flicker of memory, shock, shame, love still buried. And that was the moment my story truly began. I'm not telling this to dramatize my life. Life has never needed help doing that. I'm telling it because for 22 years, I believed Jonathan abandoned me. I believed he left me drowning so he could breathe. I cursed his name in lonely rooms, in cheap apartments, in nights where hunger gnawed like guilt. I believed he destroyed me. And in a cruel way he did, but not for the reasons I thought. I walked toward him slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast, the moment would shatter. My heart thudded like something trying to break free from my ribs. He stepped back as if I were a ghost rising out of the snow. And in a way I was the ghost of every life we lost. He could barely stand. His clothes smelled of winter and exhaustion. His lips were cracked, blue at the edges. I saw a man who had fallen all the way to the bottom. Someone who carried disgrace like a second skin. And yet, beneath ruin, I still recognized the man who used to bring me roses after long shifts. The man who once whispered dreams of a house by Lake Michigan. A garden, a family. Everything we never got to build. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run. But love, even broken, has a long memory. Before I could speak, Jonathan swayed. His knees buckled, and his body slumped toward the pavement. I lunged forward, catching him in my arms like a child. His weight surprised me, heavy with years he never lived. His head rested against my shoulder, and I felt rib bones like winter branches beneath his coat. Cold sirens filled the background of my mind. Somewhere a bus stopped. Somewhere life continued. But ours had paused. I called for help. People pretended not to hear. But a young man walking his dog rushed over. Then another woman from a coffee shop. We called an ambulance. Snowflakes drifted lazily between the streetlights like quiet witnesses. I held Jonathan's head in my lap as we waited, and memories poured like wounds reopening. Detroit. Our tiny apartment. His laughter echoing off walls we painted together. The night he left, without explanation, without warning. A note on the table reading only. Forgive me. It's better this way. Don't look for me. How do you forgive silence? How do you survive abandonment? Years turned to stone inside me after that. I worked 3 jobs, laundry, housekeeping, cashier shifts, trying to pay debts that arrived like storms, debts in his name with my signature forged beneath. I lost our house, our savings, my pride. Everything collapsed and I blamed him for all of it. But as I sat in that alley holding the man who once held me under fireworks in July, I felt something unfamiliar stirring. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not understanding, that would come later. It was something simpler. A truth I had avoided. No matter how much I hated him, I never stopped loving him. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics lifted Jonathan onto the stretcher, skin pale, breathing shallow. I climbed in beside him without asking permission. He didn't speak, but his hand brushed mine, and the gesture was enough to break me quietly inside. At the hospital, doctors whispered around us. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, untreated anemia. His body was a map of years spent surviving concrete instead of love. They connected wires, tubes, monitors that beeped like clocks counting stolen time. I sat by his bed until dawn. He slept with the stillness of someone who had been tired for decades. And as the sun rose over Chicago, pink against skyscrapers, I made a decision that changed everything. I would not leave his side. Not until I knew the truth. The hours after sunrise were slow, quiet, and unbearable in a way only waiting can be. Hospitals in America all smell the same. Disinfectant, metal, old fear. But that morning the scent pressed into me like history returning. Machines beside Jonathan's bed blinked rhythmically, indifferent to the storm inside my chest. I sat in the same chair from midnight to morning as if the past had nailed me there. My children were still asleep across the city, unaware their mother was sitting beside the man they believed dead or worse. A ghost in family history. They had grown up with absence but not truth. I never spoke his name in our home. I built walls around his memory so carefully that even I forgot how to climb out. Now those walls were dust. Jonathan lay still beneath hospital sheets, his face hollow from hunger and time. His beard was streaked with white. His hair, once thick and full, now thinned like winter branches. I had not realized how long it had been since I last touched his face, the face I once traced with young hands, believing forever was real. He looked older than 50, older than life itself, as if each year away from me took a decade with it. I wondered how someone could disappear from the world and still breathe in it. My mind drifted backward without permission. Memories poured in like open floodgates. Not in order, not gently, but heavy, unfiltered. Detroit, 1997. The apartment on Jefferson Avenue overlooking the river. The one-bedroom place with creaking floors and a balcony where Jonathan and I drank cheap wine on Fridays, pretending we were wealthy simply because we were in love. Back then, struggle felt romantic. We were young enough to believe hardship meant meaning. Jonathan worked at Reed & Morgan Infrastructure, a reputable engineering firm with city contracts, bridge restorations, public development. He wore button-down shirts with rolled sleeves, came home smelling like concrete and ambition. He would place blueprints on the kitchen table and talk about steel load, beam stress, water resistance, things I didn't understand but loved hearing simply because his voice carried pride. We hadn't built a family yet, but we planned. Weekend drives to an arbor, conversations about baby names, dreams of a home with a porch swing. We were ordinary, fragile, but happy in the way people are before the world shows them its teeth. But happiness is a temporary light, and shadows always wait. In late autumn of that same year, something in Jonathan began to shift. It was subtle at first, late nights at the office, phone calls he took outside, a tension behind his smile he couldn't hide. He began locking drawers. Papers disappeared. Conversations shortened. When I asked what was wrong, he kissed my forehead instead of answering. Silence is a language too, painful and fluent. Then one day, the day everything changed, he came home looking like a man who had seen the inside of hell. He sat at the edge of the bed without removing his coat, hands shaking like wind through dead leaves. I remember walking toward him, touching his shoulder, feeling tremors beneath wool. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I asked only once, what happened? He didn't answer. By morning he was gone. Not gone for a walk. Not gone for coffee. Gone like someone erased him from existence. His wallet disappeared, his tools, half the clothes from the closet. Not enough to look intentional, just enough to confuse the mind. Only one thing stayed behind. A folded note on our table. 6 lines. My name. Forgive me. This is the only way. Don't search. Don't wait. Live. No explanation. No goodbye. Just emptiness where a life used to be. At first I believed he left for another woman. That's the story society assigns by default. Men leave, women are left. But there were no signs of infidelity, no perfume on clothes, no phone numbers scribbled on scraps. Only fear in his eyes the night before and silence afterward. Then came the letters. Debts. Lawsuits. Frozen accounts. Foreclosure notices. My signature forged on documents I had never seen. Loans in my name, property transfers I never approved. withdrawals from joint accounts I didn't know existed. Within 6 months, the government seized everything. Our car, our savings. Even my wedding ring had to be sold to survive. I found myself alone in a rented room in the south side of Chicago, working nights at a diner, folding laundry at dawn for strangers who would never know my name. People pitied me softly, behind polite smiles, assuming Jonathan abandoned responsibility like so many men do. I let them believe it. It was easier than saying, "My husband vanished like smoke and left me with his ruin." Years passed. Poverty aged me quickly. There were nights I slept hungry so my children could eat. Nights I washed dishes with trembling hands, asking God why one disappearance created a lifetime of punishment. But I never imagined the truth was far more violent than abandonment. Back in the hospital room, Jonathan stirred. His eyelids flickered like someone waking from deep water. His breathing hitched. For a moment he was between worlds, the one where he loved me and the one where he disappeared. When his eyes opened fully, they were not the eyes of a ghost. They were the eyes of a man who carried secrets heavy enough to drown a city. I whispered his name through shaking breath. Not spoken aloud here, only remembered inside me. I half expected him to vanish again like he did 22 years ago. But he didn't. He exhaled slowly, painfully, as if life itself was burning on its way out. I wanted to ask everything. Where he went. Why he left. Who he became. Why I suffered for sins I never committed. But questions require answers and answers require strength, and he had almost none. So I waited. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped steady like a heartbeat that belonged more to electricity than flesh. I memorized every shadow in that room, because the truth felt near, like something approaching on quiet feet. When Jonathan finally found enough strength to speak, his voice was barely a breath, but his words would become the key that unlocked hell. He said only one sentence that morning, but it was enough to crush the foundation of everything I believed. He told me, "I never left you for myself." Those words lodged deep, heavy, unmovable. There in that stark white room beneath Chicago winter light, I realized nothing about my past was what I thought. The debts, the disappearance, the silence, the ruin, they were not accidents of life. They were not abandonment. They were sacrifice. Years later, I would discover the network that controlled him. The men who forged signatures, who stole our home, who pushed Jonathan into years of homelessness as punishment for refusing corruption. But in that moment, I knew only a tremor of truth, one strong enough to crack the story I had lived as reality. The next hours blurred. Jonathan slept, waking only in fragments, each time looking at me like someone unsure if forgiveness was possible. I didn't have forgiveness, not then, not yet, but I had presence. And presence was the first step toward understanding. A storm built quietly inside me. I felt anger for the years I lost, sorrow for the man beside me, and a growing terror that whatever destroyed his life might still exist, watching, waiting. I stayed in that hospital 3 nights. Didn't leave his side. Ate from vending machines. Slept sitting up, listening to machines breathe when he couldn't. It was on the 4th morning, gray, cold January damp seeping through bricks, when everything changed again. Jonathan whispered the words that would unravel my entire world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, with the weight of a confession that carried 2 decades of silence. He told me there were people, powerful men, who destroyed him to save me. He told me danger never left. He told me truth had consequences. And I realized that my story, our story, was only beginning. If episode 1 was the moment my past returned, episode 2 was the moment my truth began shaping itself into something sharp enough to cut. I had lived more than 2 decades believing Jonathan left me out of selfishness, believing I was disposable, believing I simply wasn't enough. But on the 4th morning in that Chicago hospital, as a weak winter sun slipped between half-closed blinds, I learned how wrong I was. Jonathan woke slowly, like someone rising out of ice rather than sleep. His eyes traveled the room, unsure of where life had placed him. When they landed on me, something inside him softened and broke all at once. No apology spoken, no explanation offered, just quiet recognition. 2 people with 22 years of distance between them, yet only 1 breath apart. I wasn't ready for the truth, but truth didn't care. He began speaking in fragments, voice thin, body trembling from exhaustion. If life was a house built with rooms for love, memory, regret, then he opened the door to the darkest one first. He told me about Detroit. Not the Detroit of music, industry, or dreamers, but the Detroit hidden behind glass towers and political speeches. The Detroit where city contracts were currency and silence was bought like land. Jonathan entered that world as an engineer, young, bright, Naive enough to believe integrity could survive inside boardrooms full of men who never learned to sleep without secrets. He signed papers. He reviewed blueprints. He worked on a government-funded bridge restoration project. Everything felt normal until the details changed. Budgets doubled without explanation. Contractors no one had heard of appeared on official paperwork. Invoices listed materials that never existed. Jonathan did what any honest man would do. He asked questions. And that was his first mistake. He thought corruption could be confronted like a structural flaw in a design, exposed, corrected. But corruption isn't a crack in concrete. Corruption is the concrete. It is the steel beneath the foundation, invisible until it collapses and kills the people standing on it. Jonathan tried to report what he found. That was mistake number 2. He was threatened, quietly at first, suggestions to look the other way, warnings disguised as advice. Men in suits smiling too calmly. Phone calls that ended just before words turned dangerous. He ignored all of it. He believed truth was enough to protect him. He learned too late that truth is never enough. One night he was pulled into a meeting. No agenda, no documents, just 4 men and a contract they placed on the table between them like a knife. They told him he had 2 choices. Sign the official design approvals. Or become a liability. They said accidents happen. They said early retirement could become permanent. They said a wife left alone isn't always left alive. And that's when I entered the story, long before I ever knew it. Jonathan's hand shook when he told me this. His eyes didn't meet mine. Not because he felt guilt for leaving me, but because he felt guilt for loving me enough to disappear. He had always been a man who repaired cracks in walls, tightened loose bolts in tables, patched leaks in roofs, but he couldn't repair the damage silence created. Because fear is a blueprint too, one that builds prisons instead of bridges. He said they showed him photographs of me. Not taken with love or memory, taken as surveillance. Me leaving our apartment. Me walking alone with groceries. Me unlocking the door at night. Me unaware every step I took was a threat to him. My breath turned cold hearing this. Even now retelling it, I can feel that same cold draw through my bones. He didn't run away to abandon me. He disappeared to save me. He signed documents admitting fault for fraudulent approvals. He forfeited everything. Our savings, our home, his career, his name in exchange for my life. They told him if he ever tried to clear his own name, I would be the one to vanish. He obeyed. And I paid the cost without knowing the price. I remember sitting there in that hospital chair. Hands folded so tightly in my lap the knuckles whitened. Trying to understand how love could deform itself into something so devastating. People imagine sacrifice as romantic. Flowers on graves, letters written in blood, but sacrifice in real life is uglier. It rots. It starves. It scars. Jonathan's sacrifice left him on the streets. My ignorance left me believing he abandoned me. 2 tragedies running parallel, never touching, until now. He paused, chest heaving like air was too heavy to breathe. Nurses came, changed IVs, whispered numbers as if his life was math. When they left, silence returned. Not peaceful but charged like static before lightning. He said there were more things I didn't know. Things he hesitated to speak even after 22 years. Powerful names. Federal officials. Corporate donors. A network bigger than Detroit, bigger than us. A system built to wash money through public infrastructure, while men like Jonathan became disposable. Hearing this, a strange transformation began inside me. Not fear. Not revenge. Something quieter. A slow-burning resolve. For years I had lived crushed beneath weight I didn't understand. Now I held the edges of truth, sharp and dangerous but real. If life is a wound, truth is the thread stitching it closed. Painful. Necessary. Human. The next days blurred like watercolor, half hospital, half memory. I would sit by his bed at dawn, watch snow fall onto the Chicago skyline, and unravel pieces of the past like fabric worn thin. I didn't cry the way I thought I would. My tears had dried years earlier in lonely apartments where survival took priority over sadness. Instead, I listened. Jonathan spoke slowly, like someone burying ghosts by naming them. He told me of coworkers who disappeared after asking the wrong questions. Of supervisors who suddenly owned summer houses despite government salaries. Of files erased from servers, evidence shredded like paper snow. He said he waited 10 years before attempting to return. He tried contacting me once. He wanted to explain. But someone sent him a photograph of me, older, thinner, walking alone. Attached was a note. Try again and she dies. He never tried again. 22 years later, hunger brought him back to Chicago. Not to find me. He never believed he deserved that, but to survive. He scavenged because prison was safer than honesty. He slept under bridges because bridges didn't judge. He disappeared into alleys because alleys don't ask for explanations. But fate is strange. It drags the past into light when time is ready, even when people aren't. Finding him was no coincidence. It was a beginning the world had postponed long enough. On the 6th day, something shifted again. A man in a black coat appeared at the far end of the hospital hallway, standing too still, watching too long. He wasn't family of any patient. He didn't carry flowers or paperwork. He didn't look lost. He looked like someone waiting for confirmation. He looked at Jonathan's room number. And the moment our eyes met, he turned away. Fear returned like winter wind, sharp, invisible, undeniable. Nothing about this story was safe. Not then. Not ever. But survival had already replaced silence inside me. Whatever destroyed Jonathan's life, whatever took 22 years from us, whatever threatened in shadows, I was no longer the woman who endured quietly. I was the woman who finally knew the truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot go back to sleep. Fear has a way of shaping itself into memory. One moment it arrives quietly like a shadow beneath a door. And in the next, it spreads across the room until even breathing becomes an act you must think about. That is what settled into my bones after I saw the man in the black coat outside Jonathan's room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a message. A reminder that what happened 22 years ago was not history. It was unfinished business. For the rest of that day, the air in the hospital felt different. Colder. Heavier. Every nurse walking by felt like a stranger with unknown intentions. Every footstep in the corridor sounded like a countdown. I sat beside Jonathan with the quietness of a woman who had finally stopped pretending her life was ordinary. Because ordinary lives are not watched. Jonathan slept through most of the afternoon, his body weak from years that devoured him one day at a time. Sometimes he murmured in dreams. Fragments of apologies, numbers like coordinates, names whispered like confessions. I didn't wake him. A person who carries truth like a wound must be allowed to bleed without interruption. But when evening came and fluorescent lights turned the hallway pale, Jonathan opened his eyes and looked at me as if time had caught up with us again. He asked for water, barely audible, and when I touched the plastic cup to his lips, his hand rose and covered mine with strength I didn't think he had left. He could feel it too. They knew he was alive. His gaze sharpened, aware, frightened in the way only prey becomes after years of being hunted. His voice trembled but his words carried weight like iron. He told me there was more, not just truth, not just memory but evidence. Physical evidence. Documents he kept hidden somewhere in America long before his disappearance. Proof of forged signatures, illegal transfers, falsified approvals, bribe lists, asset laundering, the kind of evidence that could collapse corporations, imprison officials, and unravel networks like cheap thread. My pulse hammered like wings against ribs. I had imagined truth as something abstract, grief, explanation, closure. But truth was real. Truth had pages, files, ink. Truth had physical form and dangerous weight. And somewhere in this country Jonathan had buried it. But like every secret capable of destroying powerful men, retrieving it required more than courage. It required decision. Silence or exposure. Safety or justice. Survival or truth. He told me the documents were placed in a storage unit outside Cleveland, Ohio, locked under a false name no one would trace unless they knew exactly where to look. He left them there before vanishing, believing one day someone might find them, or he would die first. He never imagined I would be the one to carry the risk. The moment he revealed that location, a shift happened inside me, slow, irreversible. For years I lived in the ruins of choices I never made. I suffered consequences without context, drowned in debts that belonged to men who never learned how to say my name. Now I finally held direction, not just story but purpose. I wasn't only a widow of truth anymore. I was its keeper. Night settled over Chicago like bruised velvet. Snow tapped against the window, soft as old regret. Jonathan grew quiet, watching me with eyes that feared what he had said aloud. He knew what retrieving those files meant. He knew danger wasn't past, it was patient. And patience is deadlier than action. I remained beside him long after visiting hours ended. Nurses didn't question me. Maybe pity softened rules, or maybe love is recognizable even after decades of silence. When his breathing steadied, I walked out into the hallway, not to leave, but to think, to feel the weight of what was asked of me. Under cold fluorescent lights I saw the black coat again. Not the man, just the coat. Hung over a plastic chair outside the elevators like someone deliberately placed it there so I would notice. No footsteps. No owner. Just a silent reminder. We are watching. My heart tightened but did not break. Fear sat in my throat like a stone, but beneath it was something harder, resolve. I returned to Jonathan's room and closed the door gently. He slept unaware. fragile yet powerful in the way a fallen soldier becomes powerful after war. I sat there beside him in the dim room, silence loud enough to hear my pulse, and I made a promise without speaking. If truth existed, I would not bury it again. Morning came slow. Beige sunlight filtered through blinds like diluted hope. Jonathan looked weaker than the night before, breaths thin, body small beneath sheets. But his mind lived bright with urgency. He knew what we were now entangled in. He told me I didn't have to go. He said retrieving those documents could put us both in danger. He said the network was bigger now, more powerful, more connected across states, protected by polished suits and polished lies. But he also said something else, quietly, like a confession carried too long. He didn't leave me because he stopped loving me. He left because love made me leverage. I closed my eyes as those words settled like snow over old wounds. For years I bled anger into places where love still rooted beneath. Now anger crumbled, not into forgiveness but into understanding. A softer, heavier thing. If love built this tragedy, then truth would dismantle it. By noon I had made my decision, not loud, not brave, steady. I would go to Cleveland. I would find the storage unit. I would bring back whatever Jonathan hid before corruption swallowed him whole. He tried to protest but his voice failed. Truth had taken enough from him. His voice would not take me too. I kissed his forehead, not as a wife reclaiming love, but as a woman honoring sacrifice, and left the room to inform the nurse I'd return later. But when I opened the door, the hallway was no longer empty. A man I had never seen before stood a few steps away, holding coffee in one hand as if visiting a patient. Ordinary, forgettable, perfectly normal. Except his eyes flickered from Jonathan's name on the wall plaque to my face, too quickly, too knowingly. He nodded once, a gesture small enough to ignore, meaningful enough to remember. I walked past him, heart steady like someone who had finally chosen a fight rather than inherited one. The hospital doors slid open, cold wind swallowing me whole. Traffic roared. People hurried across snow. No one noticed me. No one knew I carried the weight of history beneath my coat. No one knew I had just become dangerous. Because truth, once woken, does not sleep again. The morning I left Chicago for Cleveland was gray. The kind of gray that feels like a sky holding its breath. I didn't pack much, just a coat, a small bag, a notebook, and the determination of someone who has run out of reasons to be afraid. There are moments in life when you realize standing still is more dangerous than walking into uncertainty. That morning was mine. Before leaving, I stood for a long moment beside Jonathan's hospital bed. His face was pale but peaceful, almost weightless against the pillow. Machines breathed for him with soft clicks and whirs, reminders that time is something borrowed, not promised. His hand lay against his chest, thin as paper, veins like faded blue highways, but when I touched his fingers, they curled around mine with a strength that didn't match his body. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The truth we carried between us had become a language. I walked away slowly, afraid if I moved too fast the ground might give beneath me. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't running from the past. I was walking toward it. The drive from Chicago to Ohio is long. A ribbon of asphalt unraveling through winter fields and industrial ghosts. Silos, empty barns, half-forgotten towns. America is full of places where stories rot quietly. My windshield wipers squeaked across glass as freezing rain tapped like fingers trying to get in. I drove alone, but memory rode in the passenger seat like an old companion. I thought of the woman I used to be, young, married, building futures like houses with open windows. I thought of the woman poverty forced me to become, cautious, tired, bones sharp from hunger. I thought of the woman I was now, older, still scarred but carrying truth like fire. Miles passed. Highways blurred. Fear sat beside me, but not as master, as shadow. 3 hours in, I noticed the first sign of surveillance. A black sedan, 2 cars behind. Same exit. Same speed. Too steady to be chance. I kept driving. Didn't slow. Didn't turn. I let them follow because running confirms guilt, but calm confuses predators. Snow began falling harder, muffling the world into white silence. I crossed into Ohio under a sky thick with unspoken warnings. The city didn't welcome me, it tolerated me. Cleveland carries a certain heaviness in winter, the kind that settles into the bones of buildings. I found a motel near Lake Erie, worn carpet, flickering neon sign, a heater that rattled like memory. It was the kind of place where people stay when they don't want to be found, or when they don't want to be remembered. I paid cash. When I stepped into my room, I waited in darkness. Still. Listening. Then I saw it. A shadow slipped beneath the motel door. The shadow of footsteps pausing. Someone had followed me. There was no knock. No whisper. No threat. Only presence. and presence is sometimes the loudest warning. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting upright in a chair facing the door. Fear didn't keep me awake, purpose did. Once you choose to uncover truth, sleep becomes a luxury. The address Jonathan gave me led to an industrial strip outside the city. Cold, quiet, rows of storage doors like sealed mouths. The sky was pale silver, numb with winter. My breath formed ghosts as I walked through aisles of metal, each unit holding someone's forgotten life. Unit B17. The key Jonathan described was shaped oddly, brass worn smooth from time, with one jagged tooth like a broken secret. My hands trembled slightly as I slid it into the lock, not from fear of what I might find, but from knowing nothing in my life would remain untouched after this moment. The lock clicked. The door rose. Cold air rushed out like released memory. Inside was no clutter, no boxes thrown carelessly. Everything was organized with almost painful precision, as if Jonathan knew one day someone would stand exactly where I stood. A metal file cabinet, a weathered duffel bag, a sealed crate with reinforced hinges, and one wooden box, old, polished, unexpectedly gentle. I approached the cabinet first. My hands hovered over the drawer handles like someone afraid to wake buried ghosts. When I finally opened the top drawer, the weight of history slid forward. Folders. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. City contracts. Vendor lists. Bank transfers. Building permits with forged stamps. Proof. Written, signed, undeniable. Each page carried the fingerprints of men who believed they were untouchable. The second drawer held invoices, false ones, companies that existed only on paper. Addresses that led to empty lots. Projects approved but never built. Money allocated for bridges that rusted before they existed. The third drawer was heavier, not physically but morally. Names. Hundreds of them. Politicians. Developers. Judges. Auditors. Inspectors. Business owners. Some still in office. Some alive and secure in power. All complicit. And beneath those names, my own handwriting forged into signatures I never wrote. That drawer broke something in me. I had survived hunger, shame, ruin, but discovering how deeply I had been used felt like reopening every wound with a single cut. They took my life not because I was guilty, but because I was convenient. A name easy to destroy. A woman easy to silence. I stood there for a long moment, breathing through the ache of understanding. Truth is heavy, but it does not suffocate. It clarifies. I reached for the wooden box last. It was light, smooth, locked with an old clasp. Inside, wrapped carefully in brown paper, I found a single photograph. Jonathan at his office desk, smiling, alive before everything collapsed. Beneath it lay a small cassette tape. Unlabeled. Unassuming. Terrifying. Cassette recordings are not casual objects. They exist only when truth must be spoken without ink. And this was no ordinary truth. As I held the tape in my hands, something shifted behind me. A whisper of cold air. A sound like breath. The door of the storage unit was no longer fully open. Someone was there. Silent. Waiting. Watching. For a moment I didn't move. My body remained still but my pulse thundered. I knew the world was no longer indifferent to me. It was reacting. Because truth once touched becomes dangerous. And I had just touched it with both hands. The moment I turned and saw the storage door no longer fully open, something inside me tightened like a wire pulled to its limit. The air in Unit B17 thinned, as if the room itself was holding its breath with me. I could sense presence, not noise, not movement, just awareness. Watching. Waiting. Close. Human intuition is a quiet survival instinct, one we learn to ignore in peaceful lives. I had not lived peacefully for a very long time. My pulse slowed instead of rising. A strange, steady calm. Fear becomes clarity when running is no longer an option. The cassette tape was still in my hand. Evidence. History. Motive. I slipped it into my coat pocket, grabbed the first stack of files I could hold, and quietly closed the cabinet drawer. Not to hide truth, but to protect it until I returned again. If I survived today. The air outside the unit was painfully cold, as if winter itself had been waiting for me. Snow flurried softly, covering asphalt like ash. The hallway between units stretched empty, but emptiness has texture. That morning it felt watched. I didn't see the person at first, only the shadow. It extended long across the ground, cast by someone standing just around the corner. Still. Silent. Not approaching, not leaving. A presence meant to be noticed, not recognized. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone, but not why. Predators don't announce themselves. They let fear do the introduction. I inhaled once, slow, grounding, and then I walked. Not fast. Not frightened. Calm. Purposeful. Because panic is prey language and I refused to speak it. As I approached the corner where the shadow originated, the figure stepped forward. A man, perhaps mid-40s, clean coat, gloved hands, expression unreadable. Not the kind of person who would be mistaken for chance. He didn't speak. I didn't either. Instead, his eyes shifted to the key in my hand. The key Jonathan described, old brass, jagged-toothed. Then he looked at the storage door behind me. His silence was a question, a warning, promise. And in that moment I understood something clearly. He didn't need to stop me today. He only needed to show me he could. I walked past him, the cold between us sharp as a blade. He didn't move to follow, didn't reach out, didn't speak a single word. His presence wasn't meant to block me. It was meant to track me. To let whoever he reported to know exactly what I had come for. And that I had succeeded. When I reached my car, snow had settled thick on the windshield. My breath trembled as I brushed it away with shaking fingers. Not from fear but from the weight of knowing what possession of the truth would cost. Once inside, I locked the doors, placed the files on the passenger seat, and sat with the engine off for a full minute. Silence can be louder than alarms. I felt it ringing inside me like the aftershock of an earthquake. The man still stood near the storage units, his outline fading through the snowfall. Watching, recording, memorizing. I started the engine. The tires crunched over frozen gravel as I pulled away. The sedan I'd seen on the highway earlier emerged 4 units down, headlights flashing alive like waking threats. There was no need for subtlety anymore. They wanted me to know the game had begun. Leaving Cleveland felt heavier than arriving. The city receded in my rearview like a memory I couldn't untouch. The files beside me were more than paper, they were reason, proof, power, and danger. The sedan followed at a distance, not close enough for confrontation, not far enough to lose. A shadow on wheels. A reminder that truth invites pursuit. For miles we moved like 2 thoughts in the same mind, separate, linked, inevitable. Snow turned to sleet near Toledo, coating the interstate in slick glass. Trucks sprayed mist across my windshield, blinding me in bursts. Each time vision cleared, the sedan remained patient, watchful. I didn't rush. I didn't detour. Fear makes people unpredictable. Predictability keeps hunters curious instead of active. I drove steady, calm, like a woman with nothing to hide. Although I held evidence capable of dismantling cities. Hours passed. Ohio became Indiana. Indiana returned to Illinois. And Chicago waited like a past unfinished. Back to the hospital. It was late evening when I walked through the hospital doors again. The same fluorescent lights, same antiseptic air, same quiet that never seemed peaceful anymore. Jonathan lay where I left him, but something in the room felt altered, as if time had moved differently in my absence. His eyes opened the moment I sat down, as if he had been waiting for the sound of my steps. Weak hands trembled when I placed the files beside him. His breath hitched, relief, disbelief, grief. I laid the cassette tape on the blanket between us. He stared at it as though it were a ghost. His voice broke when he spoke, raw, thin but edged with purpose. He whispered that the tape held the voice of a man long dead, the whistleblower who first warned him, a man who disappeared weeks later, a man whose truth was captured only once, on that tape, and hidden for 2 decades waiting to breathe again. Jonathan closed his eyes, a tear sliding down weathered skin, not from pain, from inevitability, because once truth resurfaces, the world reshapes around it. Before I could speak, a sound echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not casual. Directed. Approaching. I rose from the chair slowly, heart steady, breath controlled. Jonathan reached toward me, weak but urgent, his fingers gripping my sleeve like someone drowning reaching for air. He knew what I was only beginning to grasp. We had crossed a line. And lines once crossed do not disappear beneath snow. The door to Jonathan's room opened. A nurse entered, but behind her, a man in a black suit stepped through the frame. Different coat, same stare I saw in Cleveland. He didn't look at Jonathan. He looked at me. Not with recognition. With expectation. As if he already knew what I carried. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment. My story was no longer silent. It was alive. Moving. Watched. And the truth I now held was no longer just memory. It was evidence. It was weapon. It was war. The hospital room felt smaller the moment the man in the suit entered. As if the wall shifted inward, compressing air into something dense enough to swallow. He didn't rush, didn't speak, didn't even pretend to be part of the world where illness is treated and family waits. He stood there like someone who believed presence was enough, and maybe it was. Beside the bed, Jonathan's breathing changed. Not fast, shallow. Fear without motion. Recognition without relief. His eyes stayed fixed on the man, not like you look at a stranger, but like a witness looks at the past returning in flesh. The nurse arranged medication on a tray, unaware or pretending not to see the tension. Some people survive by seeing nothing. She left quietly, and the door closed with a soft click, a sound far louder than it should have been. Became just us. Jonathan fading beneath wires. Me holding truth like a live fuse. And the man whose silence was its own language. I knew then the hospital was no longer a refuge. Safety isn't a place, it's ignorance. And once truth wakes, ignorance becomes impossible. The man's eyes traveled from Jonathan to the files beside him. Not rushed, not surprised. As if he expected them to be there. As if he followed me not to stop me from retrieving the truth, but to confirm that I had. His gaze returned to me. Steady. Unblinking. Measured. He wanted to see if fear lived in me. I let him look, not because I was fearless but because I was finished being prey. He didn't move further. He didn't need to. He had already delivered the message simply by standing there. We know. And we are still watching. He turned without hurry and walked out of the room. No words. No threat. No demand. Just departure heavy with implication. Because people who intend to kill don't warn you. People who intend to control do. Jonathan's hand gripped the sheet. Knuckles white through thin skin. His breath shuddered like something breaking under weight. I sat beside him, placing my palm faintly against his shoulder. Not to comfort, but to anchor him back into this moment. He whispered later, voice low, frail, almost lost beneath machine hum, that the man was not random. He belonged to them, the same network that once forced Jonathan into disappearance. A new generation of watchmen. The machine that kept corruption alive. They didn't want to erase the truth yet. Only monitor it. Because power doesn't destroy evidence immediately. It waits. Watches. Decides how dangerous it will become. And now, because I had retrieved it, I had become the danger. That night, when corridors hushed and footsteps thinned, I sat alone in the hospital room with only the cassette between my fingers. Jonathan slept, breath fragile but steady, eyes sunken beneath shadows of a life spent running. The cassette was small enough to hide in a coat pocket. But its weight felt enormous. Not metal, not plastic, consequence. Old technology carries a certain honesty. No editing. No erasing without trace. Whatever voice lived on that tape existed as truth untouched by time. A voice too risky to speak aloud. Too important to destroy. There was no player in the room. Hospitals don't provide machines for ghosts. So I listened instead with my fingertips, feeling grooves like scars carved into plastic. I imagined the voice that lived inside. A man who tried to expose corruption and paid for speaking. A man whose last breath may have been recorded. A man whose disappearance was not accident but strategy. All truth has blood behind it. This tape was soaked in unseen crimson. My resolve solidified like winter ice. Even if fear hollowed marrow, I would not abandon what I carried. A life is not measured in breath. It's measured in what breath protects. Jonathan stirred near dawn. His voice was weaker than before. Like wind slipping through broken windows. He said I needed to leave. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. Hospitals are monitored. Records can be accessed. Faces recognized. Names flagged. He told me with halting breath that I must take the files, take the tape, leave Chicago, disappear. Not like he did, but with purpose, not survival. There were places to go. People who might listen, journalists unbought, attorneys unbroken. Systems that still trembled when truth knocked hard enough. He told me I was stronger than he had been. Not because I didn't fear death, but because I had already survived life. He asked me, without speaking directly, to finish what he couldn't. I didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. Truth is not a question. I packed quietly. Files in layers. The tape pressed close to my heartbeat. Each paper felt like a pulse. Each folder like a bone. Evidence became part of me. Not carried but absorbed. Before leaving the room, I looked at Jonathan. Not as the man who left me, but as the man who once loved me fiercely enough to disappear for my safety. He wasn't just a husband I lost. He was a victim of power I didn't yet understand. No words passed between us. They weren't needed. His eyes told me everything. You carry the truth now. Don't let them bury it again. The elevator ride down felt like descending through years of misunderstanding. Every floor was a chapter. Every ding of forgotten memory resurfacing. On the ground level, I stepped into the lobby with calm steps. Not rushed. Not afraid. Just focused. Snow had begun to fall again outside the glass doors, white, endless, soft as ash. It covered the sidewalks like the world was trying to hide its sins beneath clean silence. I walked into it anyway. Evidence inside my coat. Truth in my hands. Resolve in my spine. Somewhere behind me a man watched, or many. But I didn't look back. Looking back is for regret. Looking forward is for reckoning. This was no longer a story about a missing husband. No longer about one broken family. This was bigger, vaster. A root system of corruption stretching beneath American ground like veins. And I had touched the heart of it. Snow followed me out of Chicago like memory with weight. It clung to the windshield, softened roads, erased tire tracks. As if the world itself wanted to hide my direction. Maybe mercy dresses itself as winter sometimes. Maybe danger looks like silence before it speaks. I did not return home. There was no home safe enough for evidence like this. My children could never be near what I now carried. Truth travels like fire. Once it jumps, it consumes everything dry with silence. I drove without destination, just distance. Out of the city. Past suburbs. Beyond highways that felt familiar. I watched the skyline shrink in the rearview mirror. Those glass towers looked calm from the outside. Unaware of how many lives were swallowed beneath them. I felt like I was leaving behind my old self, the woman who only survived. I was becoming someone else, the one who would resist. Night fell slow, long shadows stretching across frozen fields. I stopped at a roadside diner in Wisconsin, someplace anonymous where no one asked names and no one remembered faces. I sat in a booth with a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt hope, and I spread the files in front of me. Not all, just enough to see the pattern clearly. Names repeated. Signatures echoed. New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. This corruption was not local. It was national. A lattice of power built on public funds and buried in private greed. People who built nothing became rich off bridges never completed, which means thousands drove across unstable steel every day, unaware the beams beneath them were held together by fraud and rust. Lives were gambled for profit. Jonathan never abandoned me. He was swallowed by the machine he tried to expose. And now the machine had noticed movement again. Halfway through scanning documents, a waitress touched my shoulder gently, too gently, and whispered, "Someone outside keeps looking in this window." I didn't turn immediately. Danger feeds off reaction, not awareness. Instead, I gathered files slowly, wiped coffee from the table, and placed everything back into my coat and bag as if I had been planning to leave anyway. When I finally stepped into the cold night, I didn't search for the watcher. I let him exist unseen. A predator unseen is easier to predict than one cornered. My car door opened with a soft click, breath fogging in the frigid air. Headlights flared on behind me. High beams sharp enough to blind. That was the second warning. If they wanted to take me, they would have already. This was intimidation, psychological pressure. They wanted me to know they could follow forever. I drove again. Roads became long black rivers beneath fog. Trees lined like silent spectators. A world asleep except for me and them. Hours bled into each other. At a deserted gas station near Madison, I stopped only long enough to breathe. My reflection in the glass door didn't look frightened. It looked awake, painfully awake. Sometimes trauma sharpens instead of softening. That was the moment I played the cassette. In the car. Engine quiet. Windows fogged into privacy. I held the tape in shaking hands, found an old cassette adapter beneath the station counter. Dust-covered, forgotten by time, and snapped it into place. When the first crackle filled the speakers, my breath stalled. A voice followed. Male. Steady. Measured like someone speaking quickly but quietly. The tone of a man recording truth he knows may cost him his life. He spoke names. Cities. Dates. Shell companies. Amounts wired through federal accounts like veins feeding corruption. Then abruptly, his voice shook. Jonathan Reed tried to stop them. He thinks honesty will protect him. It won't. They will destroy him. They will destroy anyone who stands between them and these contracts. He said the leaders weren't politicians, not really. They were private financiers disguised as public servants, men who pulled strings behind mayors, governors, infrastructure boards. Men whose hands never touched concrete, but owned every ounce of it. Men who hid behind patriotism while dismantling the country piece by piece. Then the voice said something that hollowed me. If she ever learns the truth, she must run. They will use her name again. They already have. Her. Me. My name was in a recording I never knew existed. Spoken by a man who disappeared long before I understood the situation. I paused the tape, hands no longer steady. Snow fell outside like ash. The world looked pale and untrustworthy. I rewound 5 seconds and listened again, needing his tone to confirm meaning. It did. Someone knew decades ago that I would one day inherit this truth. Someone predicted my involvement before I even understood corruption existed. That realization felt like the ground shifting beneath road. Not coincidence. Not fate. Calculation. I hit play again. His voice continued but weaker, rushed now as if time was closing around him. He named 2 organizations, one public, one private. One we all knew, one no one should. The second name meant nothing to me then, but it would soon. He mentioned a new contract 3 states over. A bridge project expected to collapse within years if unexposed. A catastrophe waiting for silence. The tape ended abruptly. No goodbye, no closure. Just static like snowstorm wind. I sat there a long time, heart loud enough to bruise. Truth had finally spoken, and it tasted like metal and destiny. My purpose now was not to uncover evidence. I already had it. My purpose was to expose it. But exposure demands allies. And allies demand risk. So I drove toward Minnesota, not for safety but for connection. There was a journalist there once fired for asking the wrong questions about infrastructure collapse. A woman whose articles vanished from the internet overnight. Someone who knows what corruption looks like when it wears government skin. She was alive. She remembered. She trusted me. Then truth might finally breathe outside secrecy. As I crossed the state line, headlights appeared behind me again. Familiar rhythm, familiar shadow. They were still following. But I wasn't running anymore. I was leading. Dawn was pale and colorless when I crossed into Minnesota. A slow sunrise washed in frost. Roads stretched wide and empty beneath a sky that looked scraped clean of comfort. Snow-rimmed fields blurred past like unslept memories. The evidence I carried lay beside me on the passenger seat. Folders with fingerprints of corruption, the cassette like a heartbeat of warning. Truth pressed between pages aged by time and secrecy. I was no longer just a witness to this history, I was its weapon. Minneapolis waited ahead, blanketed in cold and stillness. A city of art and music, but underneath every skyline is a second version hidden beneath glass. The one where secrets live. I drove into it quietly, like someone entering a house where the floorboards remember footsteps. The journalist I sought was named Marla Hale. A name I had never spoken aloud, but I had memorized it through old archives, articles long removed from public servers, erased like they never existed. She had once written about infrastructure failures, about bridges that collapsed not from time but from intentional neglect. Her articles named contractors, hinted at collusion, questioned federal spending. Then she went silent. Not fired publicly, erased privately. Journalists don't disappear because they're wrong. They disappear because they're right. Her last known address was in a suburb near St. Paul, a narrow street lined with houses that looked too quiet. Snow muffled everything, footprints scarce, windows shuttered against January cold. My breath rose in clouds as I stood before her door, coat heavy with secrets, pulse steady like it had learned rhythm from danger. I knocked once. Silence answered, long, dense, deliberate. Then footsteps approached from inside. The door opened only a fraction, held by a chain. A woman's eyes appeared in the gap, sharp, cautious, brown with the exhaustion of someone who learned truth the hard way. She looked at me with recognition she should not have had, as if she knew I would one day arrive. Eleanor Reed, she said softly, not as a guess, as fact. My name lived in places I never entered. She didn't ask how I found her. She didn't ask why I came. She closed the door gently, unlatched the chain, and opened it wider, not in invitation but in resignation. She had been expecting truth to come back someday. Inside, the house was dim, curtains drawn, paper stacks lining walls like archives of unspoken history. The air smelled like ink and dust and coffee that cooled long before it was drunk. A single lamp flickered by a desk covered in old newsprint. Headlines like ghosts. Marla moved like someone whose body carried years of caution. She sat without offering me a seat, but I sat anyway, because the moment I stepped inside, I understood she did not need small courtesies. She needed truth. I placed the files gently on the table between us. Her fingers, thin and steady, brushed across the top folder. Her eyes scanned only a few lines before widening. Not fear, but recognition so deep it looked like grief returning for its unfinished part. She whispered names from the pages like someone reading obituaries. And then she froze when she saw my forged signature. Her voice barely moved the air. They used you as shield. I nodded once. There was no comfort in confirmation, only clarity. She turned another page, slower now, reverent as though touching historical relics. Because she was. These documents were not evidence. They were confessions pressed in ink. Proof of a network that threaded through cities like invisible wire. Then I placed the cassette in front of her. The room changed temperature, or maybe I did. Marla lifted it carefully, like something fragile enough to break reality in half. She didn't question its authenticity. She recognized the handwriting on the label. The initials of the man whose voice had warned Jonathan decades earlier. A man she once tried to interview before he disappeared like smoke. Do you have a player? She asked quietly. I nodded toward my car. Silence stretched between us, not empty, charged. She stood, wrapped herself in a heavy coat, and we walked back outside into the cold morning. Snow crackled beneath boots like bones in frost. The air tasted metallic, storm coming. We sat in the car together, two women carrying history like a loaded weapon. Static crackled as I pushed the tape in again. The voice returned, same steady tone, same unraveling truth. Marla listened with closed eyes, hands trembling not from fear but recognition. She knew pieces but not the whole. Now she heard the entire architecture of corruption. He mentioned her by name too near the end. If Marla Hale publishes what she knows, they will break her first. If she stays silent, they will break her later. Her breathing hitched, barely audible. In that moment she wasn't a journalist, she was a survivor of silencing. Her silence was not choice, it was preservation. When the tape ended, the car remained still for a long time. Snow fell softer, like ash settling after explosion. Marla finally opened her eyes, glancing at me not with sympathy but with shared purpose. "This isn't just a story," she murmured. "It's a fuse." I knew that. I had lit it the moment I lifted the storage door. Marla said she still had old notes. One she hid before being forced out, research that never saw daylight. She left the paper trail intentionally fragmented so no one could destroy everything without finding all parts. She asked one question. "Are you ready to burn for the truth?" Not emotional. Not dramatic. Practical. Because exposing power rarely ends with applause, it ends with consequences. I thought about Jonathan alone in a hospital bed. A life taken apart to protect mine. I thought about the cassette like a dying man's heartbeat. About the files inked with guilt. About engines following across states like wolves tracking scent. I answered without hesitation. Yes. Because survival without truth is still a kind of death. Marla nodded once, slow and heavy like a verdict. She offered her archive, notes, names, leads, unseen evidence. Together, our histories aligned into something sharper. Not information. Testimony. We agreed to meet again that night, safely off-grid, no phones. She needed hours to gather everything. I needed time to prepare. But danger never waits for readiness. As I returned to the motel later, snow thickening, a chill ran through me before I saw it. My room door was open. Lights on. Curtains moving. Someone had been inside. Not stealing. Not destroying. Searching. For what I carried. I stood outside that door, snow melting against my skin, and I understood the truth clearly. They were no longer just watching. They were closing in. The motel doorway stood open like a wound, wide, exposed, and bleeding silence into the hallway. Snow that had clung to my coat melted quietly onto the threshold as I stared inside. Everything looked untouched at first glance. Lamps still glowing, blankets still pressed flat, no sign of struggle. But absence speaks too. My bag sat zipped yet lighter. The files I hadn't taken into Marla's house were moved. Not stolen, just sifted like fingers through the pages of my life. Someone had been there long enough to search, but careful enough to leave no chaos. Professionals don't need disorder to intimidate. Precision creates deeper fear than violence. They wanted me to know they could reach me wherever I hid. And they wanted me to wonder what they took. I entered slowly, checking corners, windows, bathroom door. No one remained. Only faint cold in the air. A presence already gone. I stepped inside fully, locked the door behind me, and exhaled for the first time since reading danger in the doorway. When I opened my bag, I understood their message. Nothing was missing except one thing. The photograph of Jonathan at his desk. They didn't take evidence. They took memory. A warning more personal than theft. They could touch my past. They could touch my husband. They could touch the part of me still breakable. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the absence like something physical. My pulse didn't race. It steadied, cold, deliberate. Fear had stopped being a scream inside my chest. It had become strategy. They thought taking memory would weaken me. Instead, it sharpened my resolve. I zipped the bag, placed it by the door and waited. Not because I was afraid, because I knew confrontation was no longer a question of if, only when. I turned off the lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the low hum of motel heaters and the deeper hum beneath, the one inside ribs where purpose lives. An hour passed. Maybe two. Snow thickened against windows like frost trying to bury the world quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door shut gently, too gently. Then footsteps. Soft. Careful. Approaching. Not the rushed walk of a stranger. The sound of someone who knew exactly which room to reach. They stopped outside mine. Silence pressed between wood and air like a held breath. A shadow moved under the crack of the door, still deliberate. And for a moment, the world narrowed to one thin line of light where danger waited. Then, 3 soft taps. Not fists. Fingers. Not threat. Invitation. I did not open the door. I raised my voice just enough to reach beyond it. Calm, unshaken. Footsteps shifted. Paused. Left. No words spoken. No attempt at force. Because force comes only after intimidation fails. I gathered everything, files, the cassette, the key to the storage unit still pressed cold against my palm. I left the motel through the back exit into the freeze of night, breath turning to clouds that vanished quicker than truth ever could. Snowstorm wind made the world white and directionless, but I walked with certainty. Marla would be waiting. And truth must move before the system recovers. Her house lights were dim when I arrived, as if she'd learned to exist in shadow rather than draw it. She opened the door before I knocked. Another silent sign she had been expecting danger, not company. Inside, she had transformed her kitchen table into a war room. Stacks of documents, photos, archived articles printed from deep caches. Evidence that had lived in darkness now flickered under lamplight like a second heartbeat. She motioned for me to sit, then slid forward a file I didn't recognize, thin, handwritten, older than everything else. Inside were notes about him, the whistleblower from the tape. Dates of meetings. Recorded locations. A single scribbled line in red ink. If anything happens to me, find her. Her. Me. He had known long before Jonathan ever disappeared that I would one day hold the truth. That realization hit with a weight no evidence could rival. My life had been shaped by decisions I never saw, threads woven before I even understood the loom. Marla looked at me with the eyes of someone who has buried enough truth to know the cost of digging it up again. She said there was only one way to expose this network. Not through media, not through law enforcement, but through multiple channels at once so none could stop it fast enough. Release the files publicly. Upload the tape to independent journalists. Deliver evidence to contractors and survivors. Truth must scatter so widely no one could silence it again. But before we could act, she stopped, her face shifting, focus sharp, breath halting. She said my name slowly, carefully, then asked the question I didn't want to hear. Does Jonathan know you're doing this? The weight of it cracked inside me. I thought of him alone in a Chicago hospital bed, breathing through machines, carrying guilt heavier than bridges. I left him to fight a war he began, but did he want me to finish it? Or did he simply want peace? I didn't know. And I feared there was no time to ask. Before I could answer, Marla's gaze cut past me toward the window, eyes narrowing, breath pausing. She whispered one word. Car. Headlights washed against the curtains, unmoving, watching. My chest tightened, not in fear, in readiness. They had followed. They had waited. Now they were closing the distance between surveillance and interference. We had minutes, maybe seconds. Marla gathered files into a second bag. Fast but careful, years of practice behind each movement. She handed it to me, fingers gripping mine like truth passing through hands, not pages. She told me I needed to leave now, not later. They weren't here to observe. They were here to retrieve. As I moved toward the back door, snow glare brightened, more headlights, now 2, maybe 3. Engines idled like predators breathing before a strike. I stepped into the night holding evidence like a child. Fragile, precious, alive with future. Snow swirled around me, hiding movement, blurring lines. Behind me, Marla shut her door, lights going black. Not surrender strategy. They couldn't take both of us if they couldn't see us. I ran, not blindly, not panicked, purposeful, through alleys, across frozen yards, boots carving truth into snow. When I reached my car, breath loud as heartbeat, I climbed in and ignited the engine with a single turn. In the rearview mirror, men stepped from cars. Black coats. Sharp silhouettes. 3 of them. Not watchers anymore. Hunters. I drove into the storm, tires spinning through ice, windshield wipers fighting snow that looked like ash fallen from history. Headlights followed, close this time. No distance. No caution. Truth was no longer theory. Truth was pursuit. Truth was war. Snow followed me like destiny while I drove through the dark Minnesota roads. The files lay beside me, cold, heavy, breathing with truth. I wasn't just carrying paper anymore. I was carrying a buried history. My husband's life, my ruined years, a system built on corruption. All of it sat in that passenger seat like a silent passenger. The chase behind me had ended for now, but I knew it was only temporary. Truth is louder than escape. I returned to Chicago at dawn, the sky pale, colorless, quiet. Hospitals always look the same in morning light, but when I entered Jonathan's room, nothing felt the same. He looked weaker. Too pale. Like the truth inside him had finally exhausted the body keeping it alive. I held his hand, cold, thin, fragile like paper folded too many times. And I told him the truth. I released everything. If anything happens to me, the evidence will still reach the world. He closed his eyes but a tear slipped out, Not of sadness but relief. 22 years of silence lifted from his chest. He whispered a single sentence, voice breaking like winter branches. Then all of it mattered. In that moment I understood. He had never abandoned me. He saved me, and lost himself in return. He died that evening. Quietly. Peacefully. Holding my hand as if he finally believed he was forgiven. His death wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of justice. Within 48 hours everything changed. The files. The audio tape. Marla's hidden archives. The forged signatures. Billions in stolen federal infrastructure money. It all went public not through one news channel, but everywhere at once. CNN, BBC, independent journalists, government whistleblower platforms. No one could bury it. No one could silence it. Mayors resigned. Engineers confessed. Contractors collapsed like rotten pillars. Arrests multiplied across cities. My forged signatures were legally cleared. Jonathan's name, once stained, became a flag. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He became evidence. I stand on the new bridge in Washington, D.C., the one rebuilt honestly, funded legally, engineered safely. My children stand beside me, finally knowing the full truth. In front of us, engraved in steel, Jonathan Reed, a man who refused corruption, a man who loved enough to disappear, a man who saved a nation without applause. The wind moves across the water. My heart doesn't ache anymore. I speak his name aloud for the first time without breaking. Jonathan. Not with grief. With pride. He fought quietly. I finished loudly. Together we ended something bigger than both of us.